So it gives me great pleasure. I'll have our moderator introduce our speakers, but it gives me great pleasure to have this leaders panel on local governance challenges. And our moderator today, none other than Harry Forestell, news anchor at CBC TV, News Television. And without further ado, I give you Harry.
Thank you very much, Eve. And thank you all. I hope we're all looking forward to an interesting session here this morning. We'll have about an hour. The way we'd like to do this is we'll have opening remarks from our panelists, and then I will lob questions their way that I hope are relevant and interesting. But really, this is as much about you as it is about us, and the key here is to have as much participation as possible. You'll see there are 3 microphones in the room in each aisle. Please approach those microphones when and as you feel that you have questions to ask, arguments to make. They will be welcomed, and as soon as we begin, you're more than welcome to line up, and we'll address your questions as quickly as possible. 50 years ago, this province undertook fundamental change in local government. As such things usually are, the Byrne Commission was driven by wrenching economic change, social upheaval, and demographic demands, a consequence of the baby boom and 20 years of post-war transition. Now, to hear those who have studied the Commission's work and the province it envisioned, Byrne was uniquely successful in helping New Brunswick navigate the turbulent waters of social, economic, and political change. Today, those waters appear no less turbulent. The challenges faced by government seem at times almost insurmountable. A torpid economy, young people forced to travel west in search of a future, rural communities in decline, an aging population that will struggle to sustain the services it needs. This morning, we ask, why did the Byrne Commission respond to the challenges it faced the way it did? Did it succeed in meeting those challenges of the day? And what can we glean from the success that might in any way help this province adapt and weather another perfect storm? Today we'll focus on local governance. Back in 2009, one of our guests here, Jean-Guy Finn, good to see you, proposed in his report a solution among many, to reduce the number of municipal and unincorporated areas in the province from 372 to 53. And in the process to improve efficiency and save taxpayers money. There have been some steps in that direction. The question is, are they the right steps, and what more needs to be done? So our panel is going to explore 3 sub-themes we've been given this morning. Capacity, how to ensure that municipalities have the financial support and the expertise they need to deliver services to their citizens. Collaboration, how should communities work together to provide the widest range of services with the least duplication and at the most affordable cost? And change, how do changing demographics, aging populations, outmigration of the young, low immigration, the shift from rural to urban communities, how do those changes dictate both the policy challenges and the hidden opportunities we face? So we have much to discuss. Let's begin right away. Our panel will make opening remarks. We'll discuss and look forward to questions from you, the audience. If I was still in diapers in 1963, then our first panelist was perhaps even lower on the reproduction scale. I'm not even certain you were a chromosome then. Brian Glad is a lawyer and current leader of the New Brunswick Liberal Party and of Her Majesty's opposition. He is a newcomer to the political scene nonetheless. He has been finding growing support in the polls, and we'll hear much more from him, I suppose, beginning tomorrow with the throne speech. As the province's perpetual underdog, the NDP has had to jostle from outside the halls of power often to be heard. So its fortunate Dominic Carty has height and broad shoulders. He uses them both to great effect when putting across the ideas and beliefs of his party. And if you don't know who David Kuhn is, well, you just haven't been paying attention. For 28 years, David has been the face and the voice of this province's environmental movement, and since September of 2012, he has been the leader of the Green Party. He is also the only person on this platform older than me. So thank you for attending, David. All right, so we'll begin with opening statements and opening comments by our panelists. David, why don't you begin? No, I think the microphone's the desk mic.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I want to thank Mr. Bourgeois for the initiative here with this forum. It's, I think, an important one. And acknowledge Mr. O'Sullivan and thank him for his opening. And Mr. Fulton for being here, just to give the gravitas of history in a ahistorical time to an important topic and an important time in our history, I think. On reflecting about the issues of building capacity, for example, within local governments, within municipalities, some of the obvious things came to mind. It's quite loud, isn't it? You know, things like, which are actively being discussed, and the need for legislative reform to ensure municipalities have the ability to raise revenue from various sources and have authorities to meet the needs and aspirations of their citizens. But one of the areas of capacity that occurs to me that we don't talk about very much is engaging the citizens within municipalities as active citizens. That is, to engage the power of citizens or citizenry to build capacity in municipalities. Increasingly, people are demanding that. We saw in Fredericton not too long ago something called the Great Gathering. It's actually the second time it's been done. A tremendous turnout by citizens who are increasingly seeing their municipalities as the center for addressing some of the bigger issues that concern us all. Food security, energy security, local economic development, climate change, and so on. In fact, one of the committees that grew out of the Great Gathering in Fredericton was a committee to look at creating a municipal food policy council, for example. And this interest that has been growing, I think, is in part born out of the frustration of the apparent paralysis, both at the federal and provincial levels of government, to deal with these kinds of issues. And we see this too in the interest right here in New Brunswick as well in the establishment of transition towns. The idea of trying to address these kinds of issues that fundamentally are important to everyone and connect with people's daily lives in the way of food, housing, heating, and work and well-being. So the problem, of course, is, and we see this particularly in more rural communities, I would say, in discussions around creating rural municipalities, the citizenship muscle that we all have has not been used very much in recent years. And it's a little bit gone into spasm, I guess, on some issues when you see, when we looked at what happened with the attempt to sell NB Power and how many New Brunswickers mobilized around that, and more recently around shale gas. But fundamentally, that muscle's not been well used. And the sense of responsibility as a citizen has diminished considerably. So one of the things I think that would be key to build capacity within our communities is to create the kind of tools, institutional assistance to rebuild that sense of active citizenship, the capacity to actively engage as citizens. One of the things that occurred to me was that the Memram Cook Institute would be a perfect place, given its current problems, to establish an institute of local governance and citizenship for that purpose, where not only you could have residential training in place, but also outreach. And I would argue outreach in conjunction in the field with our universities and colleges, where one could imagine a small, modest extension service established in each of our colleges and universities to work with what would be the Institute of Local Governance and Citizenship. This not only would build the kind of capacity we really need in our citizenship to help our municipalities ensure that they meet the needs and aspirations of their people, but also would be a training ground for an upsurge, I would say, in interest among people in serving in municipal politics. Let me tell you, in traveling the province looking and recruiting candidates, the interest in a number of municipalities in local politics among some pretty impressive people is astounding and great to see. But to have a capacity for providing that kind of training, I think, is going to be important. And the same goes with the creation, as they are becoming created, of rural municipalities, as people become engaged, to be able to provide those people with the tools to engage effectively in their new responsibilities as they try for or offer for election to their councils. So I'm sure that's 3 minutes.
It is indeed.
Thank you very much.
And a little bit more. All right, Dominic Carty.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk about this issue, which I think is of critical importance. And one of the sad things, I think, from hearing the sessions earlier this morning was hearing how many of those themes are continuing to exist as problems in New Brunswick's governance. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, to begin with, the framework, as much as I can in 3 minutes. I'll talk fast. Et je veux dire juste en français, je vais essayer de faire mes remarques aujourd'hui, premièrement en anglais, juste pour éviter tout le monde qui n'est pas bilingue de prendre leur traducteur et faire doing the hands up and hands down thing with the translation devices. Alors je m'excuse de présenter la plupart de mes remarques en anglais. There's a progressive dilemma when it comes to municipal governance in New Brunswick, that there's a tendency for us to look back at what happened in the 60s and 70s as being the golden age of reform, and that period of time having passed, those reforms having been put in place, that we can no longer challenge or change them without in some way violating the spirit of the Byrne Commission of equal opportunity. My position, my party's position, is very much at odds with that we need to take the gains achieved through the Byrne Commission, through equal opportunity, and build on them. And that we can do that now through the emphasis on strong provincial standards and strong local government. One of the first things that we need to do is to abolish the archaic system of having unelected local governments. That local governments form the training ground. I don't disagree at all with David's point about the need for training institutes, but we usually would see in most countries, in most provinces, provincial politics being informed by strong local politicians who rise up through the ranks, understanding and grasping the challenges of government at the local level in villages, towns, and cities. And in New Brunswick, we are depriving more than a third of our citizens of that opportunity by having governments that bear no relationship to anything that by international standards would be considered to be democratic elected local governments. So a new democratic government would abolish the LSDs and create only elected governments across this province. And that's something that needs to happen as quickly as possible. In conjunction with that, we need to look as well at a transfer of power away from a provincial government, which has shown itself often deaf and blind to the needs of local communities, and to empower municipalities with real money, real tax power, real responsibilities. A prime target for us is the Ministry of Economic Development, a ministry that has not lived up to its name, despite billions of dollars being spent, and I would argue in many cases wasted over the decades. We continue not to have an economy that is developed. That money needs to be transferred in large part to empowered municipalities to give them the room that they need to be able to make local economic decisions at the local level. Clearly, this has to be in conjunction with the application of strong local standards, provincial standards, excuse me, so that we don't see the excesses that we have seen in some countries where local governments have ended up by putting their municipalities into precarious financial situations. But that can easily be done. And we have a world of evidence from other provinces and from other countries where there have been reforms to municipal governments that have moved along this very line. So there's no reason that we cannot move in a similar direction. In terms of the Finn report and some of its recommendations, I think we have to tread the line between the need to reduce the enormous number of governments and structures we have with the needs of local people to make decisions about the futures of their governance structures. So our proposal for the Democratic Party in the coming election will be a system where the regional commissions, a nice idea which has not gone far enough, need to be switched around so that rather than being a new level of bureaucracy through which the province imposes its ideas and standards on the communities with very little ability for those communities to push back. Instead, they become opportunities for collaboration and work between communities with the power resting within those councils. So the RSCs would become regional parliaments rather than the current system where they become another layer of bureaucracy. with the inclusion of fully elected representatives, we would also eliminate the problem we see today, where we have unelected LSD chairs, in some cases outnumbering and outvoting elected mayors, something which I don't believe is acceptable. So those are some of the ideas the New Democrats will be working on over the coming years, and look forward to the chance to talk more about those ideas as we go through this panel this morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share in this conversation with all of you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Dominic. And Brian Gallant, please.
Harry, I wanted to say a while ago, that's the most creative, innovative intro I ever got. In 1963, I can assure you my parents were born. They certainly weren't thinking of me, though, I'll tell you that. In 1963, we were facing a lot of challenges as a province. Il n'y a aucun doute que nous faisions face à plusieurs défis en 1963 comme province. Je suis certain, lorsque vous allez passer à travers la journée aujourd'hui, vous allez parler du fait qu'on fait face encore à plusieurs des mêmes défis. I'm sure as you go through the day, you're going to be speaking about the fact that there are a lot of the same challenges that are here today. We just have to look at, in 1901, and in fact, we would actually say that some of them have gotten worse. In 1901, our province represented 6.2% of the population in Canada. In 1961, 3.3%. In 2011, 2.2%. So obviously that's the wrong trend. We could tell ourselves now, though, okay, in 2013, are things going on the right track? Are they getting better? In 2012, from June to 2013, that 1 year period, we were the only province in the country that declined in terms of population. Every other population had an increase, some slight, but ours was going in the wrong direction. De plus, nous gardons nos statistiques, nos indicateurs économiques. En termes d'emploi, nous avons moins d'emplois que nous avions en 2011, en 2012, en 2013, parce qu'on a eu 3 années consécutives de perte d'emploi. On top of that, in 2011, 2012, 2013, our GDP had the slowest growth rate in the country. So clearly, we were facing tough times in 1963, but we're still facing tough times now. Now, I agree, just because we think that a lot of good things happened in the Byrne Commission in 1963 doesn't mean we shouldn't question what else has to be done. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't build on some of the good things that happened and some of the things that weren't so good that we can fix them. An important thing for us to realize, and one message I'd like to give you, is for us, 50 years is a long time. Il n'y a aucun doute que 50 ans, c'est un temps assez long, une période assez longue pour nous comme individus. In politics, 50 minutes is a long time. But we have to understand in the history, when we're going to look back at our province, at our country, at our society, 50 years can be nothing but a blip. So they're going to say, most likely in a few decades, from 1963 to 2013, New Brunswick went through some pretty tough times. So I like to think, however, although our challenges do span many decades, solutions can span many decades as well. And one thing that I thought was incredibly interesting reading the Byrne report is this quote: "Looking ahead 5 to 10 years, there is no more profitable investment which the province can make than the raising of the general level of education and the technical skills of its youth. The general level of wages in New Brunswick is considerably lower than in the central and western provinces, but low wages combined with low productivity repels rather than attracts new industry." Et si vous avez vu, j'ai donné un discours juste la semaine passée exactement sur ce sujet. Last week I gave a speech exactly on this subject, the fact that we have to invest in education, training, and literacy so we can get our economy back on track, we can fill the skills gap, we can prepare for emerging markets like the ICT sector that we have here in Fredericton across the province, so we can make sure that we sustain and improve the forestry sector that is so important to our province's economy. On top of that, what we're going to discuss, I think you're discussing this throughout the day, and we're going to discuss during the panel, is once we make money, once there are revenues coming to the province, there is economic development, how do we ensure we have the right structure to be socially just? How do we make sure that if I come from a family that lived in poverty, if I come from the north, si je suis un francophone, si je suis un anglophone, si je reste dans le sud, si je reste dans l'ouest, dans l'est, how do we ensure that all New Brunswickers have opportunity? So one of the main parts to that conversation, however, is how we get revenue in the province. And I think that's something that's incredibly important to always remember and maintain. But then we have to discuss what are the proper structures to ensure that we become as socially just as possible. The other little point that I'd like to make as well during your discussions and deliberations that I hope you'll consider is I've learned a few things in politics, as you can imagine. And one of them is that and I saw during the preamble to this presentation and to this day that you're going to be crunching a lot of numbers. You're going to be going through a lot of statistics, as you should. But one thing I've learned in politics is that those statistics are there because of human behavior. They're there because people are doing things that are probably very logical to them. For example, I think it's wrong for us to think that there are people that are living in Shediac Bridge, it's where I'm from, so I'll use that as an example, because they're trying to avoid some taxes. A lot of people are there because they have family land that has been in their family for generations, for 200 years, and that's why they want to stay there. I think it's wrong to say that people living, let's use Shediac Bridge again, are trying to avoid taxes and don't want to pay their fair share. One of the issues that they face is some of them are retired. Some of them have budgets literally to the dollar line. And when gas tax goes up, when their prescription fees go up, when you see almost every fee and permit and license that they pay for go up, when they also have the potential of having other types of taxes go up, it scares them. So one of the things that one message I want to give to all of you and to remind myself is often there's good reason, good logical reasons for the behavior that people have. De plus, je vais aussi vous donner un genre comme you'd say like flip of the coin here. On one side, we have a very important challenge and at the same time a very good opportunity. One of the things that's happening in our province and in our country and probably across the world is that people are now basing their decision on where they're going to live on quality of life. Maintenant, c'est un défi, et je dis qu'il y a deux morceaux de ça. C'est un défi parce que ça veut dire que des gens vont peut-être aller dans des régions rurales lorsqu'on voit qu'ils ont l'infrastructure, ils ont les méthodes de communication pour rester dans les régions plus rurales. And they'll still be able to benefit much of the cities and the municipalities. But at the same time, it's also a huge advantage because our province, relative to the rest of the country, is considered very rural. So when we are now going to be living in an age that the resource is what's between our two ears, and it's not necessarily what's in the ground, people are going to base where they live on, where they think they'll have a good quality of life for themselves, for their families, for their friends. So this is a huge advantage for us here in New Brunswick because I'm convinced we have one of the best quality of lives in the country, and the country has one of the best quality of lives that we can offer around the world. I would argue within New Brunswick, Shediac Bridge is the best place to be, but I'm sure that's up to debate here. So with this, félicitations pour avoir ce symposium, puis je pense que c'est très bien que nous continuons à avoir une discussion sur comment on peut améliorer nos structures, et j'ai bien hâte de voir vos questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian Gallant. And now, really, it is up to you folks. We're interested in hearing from you. We'd like to hear questions from the audience. In the meantime, perhaps I could start this by querying all three of our panelists on that goal of improving local governance and giving voice to more New Brunswickers in communities the length and breadth of this province. How do we achieve that in light of the dramatic demographic changes that are happening in this province, whether we talk about the youth that are heading west, whether we talk about the struggle between rural and urban centers? How do we begin that process of improving local governance? David?
Well, I mean, I think one is to listen. As I travel around the province, there's lots of interest in trying to improve local governance, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of listening going on. Here's an interesting, and there are capacity issues. Here's an interesting example. The rural municipality of Upper Miramichi was interested in establishing a community forest within the Crown land within its boundaries. For a number of reasons, to generate work and economic opportunity locally from that land base, to exercise some stewardship around it because they were quite unhappy with the singular reliance on clear cutting on those lands in their community under the current provincial system, and they had recreational objectives and tourism and so on and so forth. Anyway, they could not get the interest or authority to move forward with that in Upper Miramichi. And two, within the community, an effort to establish a committee of interested people to help steer that was very difficult to pull together because people weren't used to participating in that way around something so important. So that speaks to the need to help have the tools and the institutional ability to build a capacity within our communities to participate in local governance.
I think one of the key things that we have to address here is, again, the lack of power that we currently see in New Brunswick's municipal governments. That today, if you are a mayor, if you're a council in one of our cities or towns, you have to send your letter to get a letter of ministerial permission to get a traffic light changed in terms of a location on a street in your town or city. It makes absolutely no sense at all. And from everything I've heard, there's this vast backlog of letters that build up, with some of the town managers responding to that by sending the letters back to the minister saying, if you don't hear back in 48 hours, we're just going to do this anyway. So we end up with a breakdown of the structures that exist. And I'm going to build on a point that Brian said, that part of the problem we have in the province at the moment is that this system does work for some people, and that people aren't necessarily acting within the system out of bad intentions. But I'd switch the focus a little bit and talk about our provincial political parties. At the moment, MLAs have the ability to act as mayors and council for pretty much every area within their jurisdiction. They have more power than the municipal politicians. In the case of LSDs, they have vastly more power. So anytime anything goes right at that local level, you'll see it. You'll see the MLAs out there taking credit for decisions and responsibilities that should be and would be in nearly any other reasonably developed democracy the responsibility of local governments. When things go badly, you can either blame the minister if you're in opposition, or you can just pretend that it's actually the LSD's fault, and the small group of often powerless and disadvantaged people who run the LSDs don't have any recourse to complain, because of course if they do complain, they can be replaced at the whim of the minister with no democratic accountability at all. So this is a system that works terribly for New Brunswick in terms of allowing economic development and local control, works wonderfully if you're a liberal or conservative MLA and politician, because it allows, again, that vagueness that we see in Canada's federal arrangements between the provincial and federal levels of government, where because jurisdiction is mixed and unclear, you're able to come back and say, oh, well, you know, it's their fault if you're at the local level, or it's your fault if you're at the provincial level. So we've got to have more clarity in these structures to help address the problem that you're addressing here, and we have to have more power for those local governments. And the power has to be clear, precise, and defined, and vastly increased over where it is today, because the model that we have seen has not been working for the province, which is why we're still facing some of these challenges 40 years plus after the Byrne Commission and equal opportunity.
Brian?
So one of the things that we have to do is make sure that economic development is a priority. We do have to work with all levels of government. We have to work with all New Brunswickers and all regions to find out exactly what are some of our assets and what are some of the challenges and aspirations of all the communities. And I agree completely with what Mr. Kuhn said. Si on prend l'exemple de Boca-Raquette qui veut absolument rentrer dans l'industrie rentrer et continuer de soutenir et maintenir et même améliorer l'industrie des centres navals, non seulement que la municipalité, la région, non seulement que tout le monde dans cette communauté veut bien faire dans cette industrie, ils sont en train de pousser, ça fait des années, pour que le gouvernement provincial vienne à la table aussi. So you need to listen to people in the regions who understand some of the opportunities and challenges. And one of the good examples of this, I think, is True Growth 2.0 that happened in the greater St. John area. This is an exercise that is very commendable. This is an exercise that is very useful. It gets all communities together to talk about what are some of the collective challenges and collective opportunities. How can they work together? How can we work together with different levels of government to ensure that we're all pushing in the same direction? I also think it's incredibly important that we do have more autonomy for our cities, more autonomy for municipalities. We should be revamping the Municipalities Act. It doesn't make sense that we don't give more control when it comes to bylaws and many other things that would be on the day-to-day plate of our elected officials. We have to revamp the Community Planning Act as well. One thing that I hear across the province is they want more autonomy, you want to be able to participate, and they want to be recognized as a level of government, which all these things should definitely be the case, and we should be continuously striving to ensure that we have good conversations, and in fact that we support any initiative like we saw with True Growth 2.0, where communities are getting together to push in the same direction, and then other levels of government can jump in and do the same.
Are you prepared to ask a question?
Oui.
Please. Could you identify yourself?
Gabriel Bourgeois. Je suis un avocat à la retraite qui a eu le plaisir de représenter le gouvernement provincial dans plusieurs dossiers afférents aux municipalités. Et c'est un sujet qui m'intéresse énormément. Et je vais faire un commentaire et j'aimerais, si possible, avoir un feedback de nos invités. Essentiellement, il y a beaucoup de gens qui expriment ou qui décrivent le caractère unique du rapport Byrne et comment c'était une création du Nouveau-Brunswick et c'était extraordinaire. Quitte à prendre le risque de me faire critiquer, je vous propose que le rapport Byrne, maintenant, est un peu un albatros, c'est-à-dire un empêchement au développement du futur parce qu'on tente d'y attacher beaucoup trop d'importance. Le rapport Byrne peut être facilement égalisé avec ce qui s'est passé, par exemple, au Québec avec la Révolution tranquille. Différent, mais semblable. La centralisation de la population en Ontario après-guerre, différent, mais semblable. Et on peut passer toutes les provinces canadiennes ainsi que la grande majorité des régions d'Amérique du Nord et trouver le caractère, essentiellement l'ajustement d'après-guerre, très semblable à ce que l'on a eu au Nouveau-Brunswick. Maintenant, une fois que le rapport Byrne a été placé et mis en place, je pense qu'il avait deux objectifs principaux. L'égalité pour tous et la participation dans le bénéfice économique d'après-guerre. Je vous propose que le rapport Byrne a été au moins une faillite, au moins un de ces deux niveaux. Égalité pour tous, on peut en discuter. Là, c'est très intéressant. Il y a eu tous les programmes sociaux, la centralisation de taxation et la redistribution, et ça, c'est correct. Mais au point de vue de développement économique, si l'on regarde le niveau de sous-développement économique au Nouveau-Brunswick, maintenant, et ça ne date pas d'hier, essentiellement, n'êtes-vous pas d'accord que le rapport Byrne, en ce qui a trait au développement économique, est réellement une faillite?
Gentlemen. Dominic, start.
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Je suis tout à fait en accord. C'est possible pour quelque chose qui était à l'avant-garde 50 années passées d'être aujourd'hui quelque chose qui nous empêche de développer encore plus. Et je pense exactement que on a vu l'établissement des standards provinciaux était un grand bénéfice pour une province qui était attrapée dans le 19e siècle, dans ses systèmes de gouvernance, mais aussi à ce temps, 50 années passées, tous les partis politiques, toutes les idées sur le sujet de développement économique étaient tout basées sur l'idée que la centralisation des pouvoirs économiques au niveau central par une grande bureaucratie qui a plein de pouvoirs, ça c'était une bonne idée. Maintenant, 50 années passées, dans tous les partis, même gauchistes autour du monde, ça c'est une idée qui on peut dire que le temps est passé pour ces idées. C'est seulement au Nouveau-Brunswick encore que les partis à gauche et droite, de temps en temps, ont décidé encore que la bureaucratie a besoin d'être toujours renforcée et ça c'est la manière plus efficace pour développer l'économie. Et on a vu clairement que ça n'a pas bien marché. Alors, je veux donner une quote de Tony Blair qui a dit « On a besoin d'avoir les principes qui sont divorcés des prescriptions spécifiques de politique. » Et c'est ça qu'on a besoin, parce que c'est clairement exactement ça qu'on a besoin de toujours nous souvenir que la raison que nous sommes ici en politique pour faire le travail est pour assurer les opportunités et le bien-être de la population de la province. Et les politiques qu'on choisit comme gouvernement sont basées sur comment est-ce qu'on peut promener rapidement vers ce but d'élargir le potentiel de tout le monde, tous les citoyens et citoyennes de notre province. C'est clair que les standards provinciaux étaient essentiels dans les années 60. C'est clair que dans 2013, on a besoin de décentraliser le pouvoir économique de Fredericton à les communautés. Parce que c'est là où on peut donner l'opportunité aux maires et conseillers d'entendre les gens qui sont dans leur communauté. Parce que pourquoi est-ce que les bureaucrates ou même les politiciens à Fredericton vont connaître comment régler les problèmes de le développement d'économie en Belledune, en Sackville, en Hampton? Ça ne fait pas de sens. Alors, on a besoin d'assurer que tous les services essentiels de santé, d'infrastructure, d'éducation sont bien gérés à Fredericton, mais l'implémentation, les décisions au niveau local, on a besoin de passer le pouvoir au niveau local. Alors ça, c'est un peu je suis complètement en accord avec vos propositions. On a besoin d'avoir le courage de dire, on peut dire que les choses qui arrivaient en les années 60, c'était excellent. Mais c'est une nouvelle génération. On a besoin de bâtir sur la fondation et créer une nouvelle maison qui est assez forte pour soutenir en face des défis de l'année 2013 et les années qui viennent.
right,
Je m'excuse de
thank you.
mes erreurs en français.
Brian and David, would either of you like to respond to that?
Merci beaucoup, Gabriel, pour votre question. Je pense que une chose que je suis d'accord, il faut faire attention d'apporter de l'émotion dans nos décisions, de re-questionner des choses et des politiques et même des idéologies ou des idées. Alors, je suis d'accord qu'il faut absolument que nous ayons le courage de questionner qu'est-ce que le rapport Byrne a amené, de questionner qu'est-ce qu'on devrait bâtir dessus concernant le rapport Byrne, qu'est-ce qu'on devrait améliorer ou même totalement changer. Ça, je suis complètement d'accord. Là, il faut faire un peu attention de dire que c'est en raison du rapport Byrne que notre situation économique se trouve où elle est tout de suite. On a eu 50 ans de politique économique qui a joué un gros rôle, qui a joué évidemment à nous rendre où nous sommes en ce moment. Moi, qu'est-ce qui fait plus peur? C'est comme j'ai dit lors de ma présentation, il n'y a pas de doute que la population en termes relativement parlant au reste du pays, est en décroissance qui est très malheureux et préoccupante. Mais au même temps, il faut s'assurer qu'on comprend qu'au fait de 50 ans, tu peux avoir des défis, tu peux avoir des problèmes qui ne vont pas nécessairement s'en aller comme ça. Ça prend une génération, ça prend des décennies pour être capable de faire face à ces défis. Moi, qu'est-ce qui fait plus peur, c'est lorsqu'on regarde, est-ce que nous sommes sur la bonne voie en ce moment? Est-ce que nous sommes sur la bonne voie de ne plus avoir les mêmes sortes de statistiques que nous avons en 1963 et que nous avions juste une couple d'années passées? Et lorsqu'on regarde la création d'emplois lors des 3 dernières années consécutives, on était la pire au pays. Lorsqu'on regarde la croissance de notre PIB pour 3 années consécutives, on était le pire au pays. Lorsqu'on regarde la population pour la période de juin 2012 à juin 2013, nous étions le pire au pays. Alors, c'est ça qui fait plus préoccuper. C'est dernièrement, on n'est certainement pas en train de se remettre sur la bonne voie et juste le contraire, on est en train de même aller et continuer et aller plus loin sur la mauvaise voie.
Dave?
Oui, merci pour la question. Je suis en accord avec vous, avec cette observation. Donc, dans notre gouvernement, il n'y a pas de concept de l'économie, le développement de l'économie économique locale. As a result, the only frame that's there is for large sort of export-dominated development or imported mega-project style development. And we have examples around the province of municipalities that have initiated things for economic development, like I was talking about with Upper Miramichi and the rest of Gush. The communities came together with a proposal for, and in Memramcook, for community-based wind-generated electricity, and Bathurst ideas around using wood for fuel to generate heat and power in the community go nowhere. Because it doesn't fit with the frame of economic development that is centralized within Fredericton.
Bonjour. Mon nom, c'est Yvan Godin, maire de Bertrand, péninsule acadienne. J'ai entendu des choses intéressantes venant du panel. Entre autres, M. Carly, lorsque vous dites que vous visez la pleine municipalisation, c'est-à-dire que les gens qui sont assis présentement à la table devraient être des gens élus. Je partage entièrement ce que vous venez de dire là. Une chose intéressante, M. Galland aussi, vous venez de dire que les plus grandes richesses, les plus grandes ressources, c'est entre les deux oreilles des gens. Et ce n'est pas nécessairement dans le sol. Ça fait longtemps qu'on n'a pas entendu ces paroles-là. Si ça c'est vrai, je ne comprends pas aujourd'hui pourquoi les commissions n'ont pas de droit de regard sur le développement économique de leur région. Donc si c'est vrai que les plus grandes ressources se passent entre les deux oreilles des gens, je pense que ces gens-là devraient avoir droit de regard sur leur développement économique. Ce que je veux dire en terminant, les commissions ont été instaurées, c'est un peu du gavage, c'est-à-dire que ça nous a été lancé dans pleine gorge, trop rapidement. Je ne dis pas que c'est pas bon, je dis que c'est bon parce que présentement on discute à une table où c'est presque impossible, on est 24 personnes à notre table chez nous, c'est déjà là un succès énorme. Sauf que on est rendu à une étape où est-ce que c'est que j'espère que les gens qui sont assis à cette table-là, les futurs représentants politiques, vont décider d'une évaluation, de prendre le temps d'évaluer là où on est rendu un an après avec ces commissions-là. Ma crainte, et celle-ci, c'est que présentement, on s'en va vers des votes en bloc, c'est-à-dire des villes qui vont voter en bloc, des DSL qui vont voter en bloc et des municipalités qui vont voter en bloc. Et si c'est là qu'on se rend, on s'en va vers une déchirure extrême. Donc, on est à un moment où il faut faire une évaluation. On n'est pas loin dans le processus. Il faut faire une évaluation et j'espère que ça va être dans vos convictions de regarder qu'est-ce qui se passe présentement pour qu'on travaille ensemble et non pas des clans contre clans. Et c'est ma grande crainte. Merci.
Thank you. Any response, gentlemen?
Sure.
Dominic?
Merci beaucoup pour la parole, la question. Je suis complètement d'accord. C'est pour ça qu'aux côtés des néo-démocrates, on va éliminer le département de développement économique parce que ça n'a pas réussi dans son tâche de développer l'économie. On a besoin de partager les ressources de ce département avec les municipalités, avec les villes, avec les villages de province, parce que c'est à eux de décider le futur et de créer les conditions pour améliorer leur économie. Et c'est aussi sur la question des conseils régionaux, absolument. Je pense qu'ils ont besoin d'avoir le pouvoir et aussi l'égalité, comme j'ai dit, que tous les représentatifs devraient être élus. Sinon, on va seulement réussir de créer un autre niveau de bureaucratie contrôlé par Fredericton, qui va encore mêler les choses et rendre encore plus difficile de tout le monde dans la province de connaître qui exactement est responsable pour prendre des décisions. Et c'est aussi quelque chose, juste pour passer sur quelque chose que M. Galland a dit sur le fait que ça prend beaucoup de temps. Je ne suis pas d'accord. Professeur Byrne a dit ce matin que c'était seulement 3 années que la plupart de ces réformes étaient mises en place. On voit les pays comme Singapour, c'était, j'ai oublié en français, une swamp. Après 10 années, il était un des pays les plus développés au monde. Les pays en Europe après la Deuxième Guerre, on a vu le développement rapide. La plupart du temps, les périodes de développement les plus rapides sont les périodes brèves en termes des années, mais intensives en termes de travail et le courage des politiciens. Et c'est ça qu'on a besoin aujourd'hui dans notre province. On n'a pas besoin d'attendre, de dire que ça va prendre des décennies. C'est une excuse pour les politiciens qui n'ont pas le courage pour changer les choses.
Gentlemen, either one of you is welcome to respond to those comments as well, or we can move ahead with other questioners. So. Sure, go ahead.
Regarde, merci beaucoup pour vos commentaires. Et c'est comme je disais dans la présentation, il faut commencer à écouter les personnes dans les régions, écouter les personnes qui connaissent les défis, connaissent les opportunités dans les communautés. Et c'est évident, c'est qu'une communauté veut se rallier pour se concentrer sur le développement économique. Je pense qu'on est tous d'accord que la création d'emplois et l'économie, c'est une des plus grosses priorités et des plus grosses craintes présentement à travers la province. Alors, si qu'une communauté veut se rassembler, pourquoi que le gouvernement provincial les arrêterait de faire ça? Alors, merci beaucoup pour vos commentaires.
Sir, you're next, and then our middle microphone.
Thank you. Greg Keeley, University of New Brunswick. A quick comment and then a question. Quick comment is that in terms of David's comments about the need for training, et cetera, Yves Bourgeois' institute, the Urban and Community Institute at UNBSJ, is exactly intended for those kind of purposes, and I'd encourage you to talk to him about the things that we can do together in addition to holding this session today. But that's really what the vision for that institute is in those terms. The question I have is one that is before the province in a very serious way, and I'd be curious as to how you would see your comments about local governance and the needs for changes in local governance fitting with the needs of First Nations governance. And how do we get the right intersection of those things as we move to what I hear all of you saying is a more devolved local governance structure?
Let's have some answers to that one. If you can keep your remarks brief, that would certainly help, because we do have other questioners. David?
Well, I guess the first thing to recognize is that the treaties and Aboriginal rights precede whatever the provincial government might do, and right now, and that's got to be addressed. We are well behind the times in reaching some kind of agreement in how the treaties are implemented in New Brunswick, because First Nations have been treated for the longest time as, at best, a federal responsibility, kind of like fish, or at worst, people you just don't want to talk to by our provincial government. So this is essential, that discussion begins now, and the opportunity is there. There are a lot of issues that need to be resolved, but you know, when I was doing a lot of work promoting community forestry and working in local areas around that, First Nations communities were as interested as some of their neighbors in that approach, and were as interested in some kind of collaborative approach to community forestry. So it really does come down to beginning that discussion in a meaningful way between the province and First Nations, and then when we get to that point where there's some agreement as to how to, an understanding as to how treaties are implemented today, then discussions at a regional level between First Nations and local governments become very possible.
Gentlemen?
So at the moment, I think we have to recognize that we're in the middle of an incredibly difficult circumstance. I'm sitting here, my phone is buzzing with reports from people who are sending me information from Elsipogtog about the fact that blockades are again going up on roads, being prepared, and that we're probably in for another very difficult few weeks as a province. The situation we're in now is because for hundreds of years there's been systemic discrimination against First Nations people, and in which, unfortunately, the representatives of our formal governments, the provincial and federal level, have contributed to, in many cases, the intentional destruction of First Nations institutions and governments. Now, belatedly, we're saying we want to have a nation-to-nation partnership. It's our responsibility as a province to make sure that we offer all possible support to First Nations governments going forward so that we can create those nation-to-nation relationships. We're in a nearly unique situation in New Brunswick with being in a province where we are governed by a peace and friendship treaty that does not answer many of the precise questions dealt with through other treaties in other parts of this country. We have to start negotiating with the First Nation governments on how to formalize relationships between those communities and our provincial government that can be mutually beneficial. A very short example, in Elsipogtog, brand new health center, legally prohibited from providing health services to people from non-First Nations communities nearby, despite the complete willingness of the Band Council to enter into that arrangement. So there are things like this where there are similarities with the distortions and perversions of the way we run our municipal governments. So let's try and, instead of being always behind, why don't we take on ourselves a challenge, the next Byrne equivalent to the Byrne Commission? How can a provincial government in Canada establish those nation-to-nation relationships, regardless of what happens between the federal government and with its responsibilities for our First Nations? But there's an opportunity here for really breaking the mold and trying to make sure that we can be the first province in this country to genuinely include First Nations, not just as people with the culture and distinct background, but as governments. And that should be part of a government reform program, and it would be under an NDP government, along with the municipalities reforms that I've previously discussed.
And Brian?
In politics, we have to do a lot more consultations and a lot more dialogue and discussions. I think that's very clear, and I think all three have mentioned that in some form today. It's not just about local governance; it's about all aspects of government and its policies. But it has to be meaningful, and it has to be a real dialogue. And a real dialogue isn't just going to listen and you write on a piece of paper and you throw out the piece of paper after the session. We have to present problems, present challenges, present possible solutions and opportunities, and have feedback and a proper proper discussion in general. Now, when it comes to First Nations, not only should we be doing that, because we should be doing that in all aspects of government, we actually have to do that. It's incredibly important for us to respect the duty to consult policy, and I would even argue to improve it. The duty to consult, the duty to consult comes from the Supreme Court of Canada, saying that the Crown has the duty to consult with First Nations. And it's incredibly important for us to realize that the Crown cannot delegate this responsibility to anyone. So when I get up in the legislature and I ask the Premier in the month of June whether there was proper discussions and consultations happening with First Nations regarding the pipeline, the Energy East pipeline, regarding shale gas, it's not adequate of an answer. It's incredibly inadequate to say, oh, well, the companies are looking at it. Yes, don't worry, it's all happening. You cannot delegate to the companies the duty to consult with First Nations. On top of that, one of the things that's a bit worrisome within the duty to consult policy is we have the framework, unfortunately, that it's only with natural resources, maybe with some energy projects. But the duty to consult can come from almost anything and everything that government does. It can stem from something that's directly affecting rights of First Nations or indirectly affecting. So we have to get away from the mind frame that the only time we have to talk to First Nations would be regarding natural resources. There are many projects across government that requires that duty to consult to be properly done.
Sir.
Yes, my name is Daryl Prince. I'm from Gemseg, New Brunswick, in the parish of Cambridge. Now, in 1961, when the Byrne Commission was sort of created, we were, I think from the last panel, about 3.6% of the population. Now we're at 2 point something, and yet our bureaucracy has increased at least 2 or 3 times, and we have basically the same number of, or less people, and our workforce has remained stagnant. But if you take the increase in our bureaucracy, and I might get shot for this, but they've expanded about 2 times, so the private workforce has actually decreased more than it really shows when we say our unemployment is down, because unemployment and bureaucracy is up, private is down. And then we've turned around and created 11 regions, which we were told would be revenue neutral, and that is, of course, the farthest from the truth, because we've created more bureaucracy. We have 12 regional directories. We've broken up a couple of our planning commissions. So we're basically have increased the bureaucracy and have to yet, in my opinion, have not been revenue neutral, and I can't see it being revenue neutral in the future. And if anybody can, I'm sorry there's no government representative at the table here, but I'd like to know how these regional, these 12 regions are going to really increase participation, because we're still dictated to by the government. They, at the beginning, we were told to require a budget, but then we were told, well, this is the budget that you have to approve. If you don't, a minister will. So basically, I still find that, and I'm vice chair of Region 11, that we still don't have very much autonomy at this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And of course, the other thing is it's increased the burden on mayors and local service district representatives tremendously in terms of their time and resources to have to participate in the regional commissions. I don't know how they're doing it. The regional commission's mandate has been delivered from on high, and I guess my feeling about the regional commissions is, as institutions, they have potential if the members of those regional commissions could reach an agreement on what their mandate should be, and then tell Fredericton what their mandate is, and move forward from there. Because at one level, there should be good areas for collaboration, a good mechanism for collaboration, which we haven't really talked about on the panel yet. On the other hand, they were conceived in a very narrow way to achieve some agenda around downloading service delivery by the provincial government as sort of a budget-cutting measure, is my short take on it. Whether people agree with me or not, that's how I see it. So I say let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. Let's have the municipalities and the rural communities look at those regional commissions to say, how can we make these work for us, and go to government and say, this is the provincial government, this is what we think they should be doing.
We're going to start running out of time here, and I'd like to get as many questioners in as possible. So if the other members of our panel don't object, can we move along to another question? Dominic, do you have something specific that we'll add to?
No, I think just to agree with David, but we do need to, I think you have to have the regional service commissions empowered by the municipalities, but the framework still has to be set by the province. So the only thing I would disagree with David is that you can't have individual commissions saying, well, we're going to do all of these things, and another one saying they'll do less. Then we'll need more levels of bureaucracy to deal with the differences between each of the commissions, which would be counterproductive.
Brian?
Just to add that, like I said in my presentation, I agree there has to be more autonomy. And in fact, add a bit to what Mr. Kuhn was saying. When it comes from the region, you can have some very phenomenal things that happen. The Regional Facilities Commission in St. John that occurred in the late 90s, where they got together to have the 5 big facilities: Harbor Station, Aquatic Center, Trading Convention Center, and many others. So, you know, a decade ago, they realized the potential benefits and advantages to working together. So when it comes from the ground up, it becomes that much more solid. Participation is that much more solid. And the ideas come with people that know the local assets and aspirations, challenges, and possibilities.
Microphone 2.
Alexis Fenner, Mayor Plaster Rock. Hello, Mr. Gallant again. I'm tired of seeing people talk continuously about what's going to happen and what they're going to do. We've developed a province. I'm the newcomer, I'm the new kid on the block in this province. But this province now is subsidizing every other province in Canada with educated kids. We are one of the, or could be one of the richest provinces in natural resources in the whole of this country. You've got infinitely renewable resources in forestry. You've got gypsum, potash, continue on and on and on. Yet we are doing nothing to develop these. Locally in my village, you can buy refined gypsum, $50 a ton. Yet this country is still importing it from the Middle East and from the Far East at $240 a ton when we got the market there. We've been begging for help. The infrastructure of this province is way down the Swanee. You look at the roads that we have trucks driving along and the movement of our goods. We got kids that are willing to work. We got kids who are going on for further education. They go into every other province. They're going across the border. Instead of talking, why don't we get the banks on our side? Why doesn't the government come out? Why can't we not get the investment? Not everybody is going to live in a city. I tell you one thing now. There'd be no bread on the table, there'd be no potatoes on the table, there wouldn't even be a table if it were not for the rural communities. We're the people that feed the cities. Yet, we're the ones that are left out of everything. We want a better voice in the village. We wish to go on and become a rural municipality, not just a village municipality. Our Regional Service Commission, incidentally, that I sit on the board of, is doing absolutely fantastic. We're getting there, and we're in advance of many other zones. But I listen, you say, Mr. Gallant, you said 50 years. 50 years can be 5 decades of welfare. We cannot stop. It's up to the politicians. You guys got to get up, and you got to stand up, and you got to get these kids back to work again. You got to get the parents back to work again. I got families in my village. Every year I feed 1,200 people. I beg Christmas dinner, 1,200 people. Out of that, 400 to 500 can't afford a Christmas dinner. And I'm not a charity, I just help. I've got kids going to school cold. I've got kids going to school hungry. What are we going to do about it? Never mind 50 years. What are we going to do about it now?
Let's put that question to the panel, Mayor. Thank you.
So if I may, yeah, I think that you make a very good point. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about education, training, and literacy is because we can fill jobs right now. We can get people working. There are jobs waiting for New Brunswickers, but unfortunately they don't necessarily have the skill set to do so. So in the short term, I'm convinced it's one of the best ways to get people back to work. It's one of the best ways to get our economy restarted. But in the long term, it's one of the best ways to ensure that we're ready for the new economy, whether it be ICT sector, which we're doing incredibly well in as a province already. So imagine if we make it a focus, imagine if we invest properly. It can help the forestry sector. One of the best ways to help the forestry sector is through education, training, and literacy. You have to look at Finland. They're a prime example. They invested in those things, and then they saw their forestry sector totally revamped, totally revitalized, because they had better equipment, which allowed them to compete on international markets. They had skilled workforce, which made them more productive, and they found ways to add value to their products. So in the long term, it'll help traditional industries, it'll help our new emerging industries, and on top of that, it's one of the best social equalizers. We talk about equal opportunity for an individual. If you give them the proper education, training, and literacy, they're going to be able to do any job that they want to do and to do it well. But to your point, because I hear that argument a lot, and it's a valid one, to say, well, if we invest in education, training, and literacy, are we just educating people and sending them off other provinces? And I've heard that. We were ranked 57th out of 60 in terms of affordability to post-secondary education in 2004. And I know it's a little outdated, but the reason I use this report is because the two things they looked at are very interesting. They said, what are the tuition rates? What are the debt loads in your province or state? So it was 10 provinces, 50 states. We were above average. Then they said, what are the salaries that the students can make before their studies, during their studies, and after their studies to pay for the tuition and pay for the debt load? So we were below average. So if we're paying more than the average province or state, and we expect people to stay here, but they're going to make less than the average province or state, that disparity is what's causing people graduating and say, well, I have important debts. I got to go. I got to go out west. I got to go find a job somewhere else. So, point being, education, training, and literacy is the key, but we have to realize there's two things. We have to make it accessible, and we have to make opportunity move up as well.
All right, Dominic?
I don't think anyone would argue that education has got to be central. It's something the NDP has been very clear will be the central platform in our election campaign next year. And we have a universal job training program that was endorsed on the same day by the Telegraph Journal and the Federation of Labor, which I think is something that happens fairly rarely in New Brunswick. So we've also got to be precise, because it's very easy to talk about how we want to do nice things for nice people, but we've got to be very clear about what our actual plans are for the first day that a new government comes in and how it's going to pass those laws and make these changes. So absolutely, education is critical across the board. In terms of dealing with the issues of rural communities, we've got to get over this division between rural, urban, north, south, French, English. We need strong cities to provide the economic engines that will feed growing communities in the rural areas that will have enhanced marketplaces for their goods. One of the ways we do that, make sure that local governments are elected so that the voices of elected mayors aren't drowned out by people appointed by provincial cabinet ministers. Then we need to make sure that we reduce the power of the provincial government to continually interfere in the management of local government. We've got to pass a law. This is very common in many countries. I worked overseas for many years in developing countries on democratic development. This is a standard thing to do. Restrict our MLAs, make it illegal for them to, under any circumstances except in their own offices, to hire or fire any provincial government employee, make it illegal for them to interfere in any tendering process. This is a standard anti-corruption law. That's what it's called internationally by the UN and other bodies. We do not have it adopted here. Why? Because we have a small provincial elite that's run the province for 150 years, very good at talking about education, very good talking about healthcare, very good talking about all sorts of things, very poor at actually delivering, because the one small group that continues to benefit from the old system is the people who continue to run our province. And that's what I'm aiming to try and change starting next September.
Thank you, Dominic. David?
One of the things we want to see is the provincial government become allies to our local governments. Absolutely, to focus on building local economies and the singular focus on export-based economies in this province. We need to have both these fronts going forward. And rural communities in particular, when I say that, looking at ways of keeping the money circulating at the community level, keeping the money circulating at the provincial level, and that means looking at import replacement strategies. That means looking at things like food security, where rural communities have a tremendous role to play, to produce the food for everyone, including our cities in New Brunswick here. The cities provide a huge market for that, and if that market is there, which the provincial government can help build, then the opportunities for livelihoods and businesses in rural communities just expand. So that's one example.
All right, I think we're at our last question now. If I could ask you to be as succinct as possible, and if our panelists could also be succinct in response, that would really help, because we're cutting into other sessions here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Trevor Hansen, a transportation researcher here at UNB. And I've worked in a number of rural communities studying transportation issues. I even serve on my own LSD council. And some of the issues with transportation access and affordability really have the potential to be addressed at the local level, but do require some kind of provincial policy. And and there seems to be a separation between local governance and transportation. Even in my rural plan committee, transportation was off the table. So my question is, how are rural and local transportation issues incorporated into policy at the provincial level?
It would be good if, to start with, we had a provincial public transportation strategy, which we don't. We're one of the few provinces that don't, and we're one of the few or only provinces that doesn't invest any money directly in public transportation out of the provincial coffers. Those two things have to happen so that we can move forward in building a comprehensive public transportation network that serves the needs of people in rural areas, people in the outlying areas of cities, and people within cities. That was something like that was promised by the previous Liberal government, and it didn't occur. It was promised by the current Conservative government. It didn't occur, and that's a strong priority for the Green Party.
Agree with everything that David said. Add one other component to it, that with the regional service commissions, this is something else that naturally could be part of their responsibilities, that we have in the Finn report the encouragement of mass amalgamations. My idea is much more that we should look for voluntary coordination of services, with the province offering increased tax room for communities that work together. So if 2 or 3 or 4 communities are willing to work together on transport or recreational infrastructure or what have you, let's make sure the province is there to encourage that cooperation. And that could result in some cases in amalgamation if communities decide they have enough common interest to be able to work together on everything, or it could result in communities that, although they maintain separate councils, are coordinating it and sharing every single other resource that they control and manage.
I think we have to change the framework in which we look at transportation and infrastructure investments. Right now, it's political. Unfortunately, most of the time we're saying, okay, well, which road as a province, we're saying which road do we want to pave to try and get some votes. I mean, that's incredibly wrong. It's not only morally wrong, it's not helping our social fabric, it's not helping our economy. So we have to look under the framework of saying, how can we invest in our road and infrastructure to ensure that we develop our economy and we make our province socially just. And once you look under that framework, you are going to be talking to the people in the communities who better understand exactly what type of support and infrastructure investments they would need to boost their economy and to make sure that we have good roads that are safe and that are able to ensure that everybody is able to be mobile. So changing that framework is absolutely a priority if we're able to really focus on why we're investing in our roads and infrastructure.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your time this morning, for your fulsome answers, and I want to thank the audience as well for some provocative questions and interesting insights. It's been a pleasure to be here.